Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Gary, for that introduction. It's really good to be here. The last time actually I was in this room was for Labour Party conference to talk about one of my other priority areas, which was Brexit, and dealing with both Brexit and the Black Attainment Gap, two huge issues facing higher education at the moment. But as I said, really good to be here again and to be at this conference. As was mentioned, I am on the Advanced HE board. I was previously on the HEA board and then moved over to the Advanced HE board, and have been really encouraged by the conversations happening at board level and making sure that the offer from Advanced HE to the higher education sector remains strong and remains relevant for the coming years. What I'm going to do today is really focus in and hone in on the Black Attainment Gap. As I said, it was one of my top priorities coming into this role. I'm now going into my second term. And when I looked at the different ways in which previous individuals had interpreted my role, because of the sheer amount of sector commitments, and because of some of the really big changes that had been made to higher education, it had been a very reactive role. And I made it very clear to our national conference that I wanted this to be a position where we set the agenda on some issues, not just responding to what was happening. So I made it very clear when looking at the Black Attainment Gap that I didn't think was acceptable, and that we were going to make some progress on this area and show some leadership. So what I'm going to do today is look at where we are with the Black Attainment Gap. Many of you will know these statistics already. Many of you will be working on them, but I think it's important to highlight exactly where we are. To talk about some of the potential factors behind it, and then talk about what NUS is doing in this space. And we're currently doing a joint project with Universities UK. Talk a little bit about that and talk about what's come out of that project so far. And then talk about some of the long-term changes that we need to consider. Where exactly do we want to get to, and how are we going to get there? But before we do that, I want to take you back to the late 19th century, the height of the British Empire, the height of colonialism. And I want to take you to a region which is now in modern-day Nigeria, to a city-state called the Royal Kingdom of Benin. Now, this was a sprawling city-state. It had a huge, powerful role in the region. It commanded a lot of power and a lot of authority, and at the center of the city-state itself, but also at the center of power, was a royal family which ruled the city. And it was actually, we know now, a city that was very advanced for its time. It'd been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's believed to have been one of the first city-states in the world to have street lighting. It was also believed to have a very complex architectural structure, which was unrivaled in its day. But obviously, if we're talking about the late 19th century, this was around the time of the scramble for Africa. The colonial powers are looking at how they can divvy up the continent, how they can make sure that they secure their own positions of power in the region. And the city-state hadn't been penetrated yet. It was still independent. It was still on its own. So there was a plan and a strategy being hatched about how that strategically important city was going to be taken over. So an envoy, a sort of delegation from the British Army goes on this expedition and heads towards the city. And they're told in no uncertain terms that they should cross the perimeter because there was a religious festival going on. They ignored that warning, and then there was an ambush, and the delegation was killed. The response from Britain was swift, and what became known as the Punitive Expedition of 1897 had one aim, and that aim was to really raise the entire city-state to the ground. And in terms of their mission, they were successful. The entire city-state was destroyed, and alongside that, the royal family was put into exile, and lots and lots of items were looted from the city. Now, one of the things about the city-state, which probably isn't uncommon for many ancient African kingdoms, was the real value that was placed on artifacts, on objects, on artwork. And I would imagine that when the soldiers entered the city, they would have been struck by the sheer amount of artwork and sheer amount of sculptures that were dotted around the entire city. I mean, they must have been, because they took most of them. And they brought them back to Europe, and about 5,000 of these pieces were then scattered around Europe. So fast forward to 2013. I arrive at Cambridge University. I am obviously very excited to be there, but obviously very nervous. It's, I've heard a lot about it. I'm wondering whether or not they made a mistake about letting me in. And really, it was, a real huge experience for me. I threw myself into lots of activities. I joined lots of societies. I got involved in student representation. I wanted to make the most out of my university experience. Every day, we would go into the dining hall, and this sort of ancient dining room, I think from the original sort of 12th century, when the college used to be a monastery. Used to walk in, and on the left, there was a plinth, and on the plinth was a sculpture of a cockerel. It was something that the whole college community recognized. The college's own emblem was a cockerel, so everyone assumed that was what the connection was. And there was a small inscription on it in Latin, so obviously no one could really understand, other than the classicists, obviously no one could understand what it said. But it was, the rumor was that it was stolen from a tribe, and they want it back. So I didn't really think very much of it. I then became president of the Students' Union at the college, which was a part-time role. And I remember in one of our first meetings, one of the officers, I think it was the LGBT plus officer, actually said to me, "Oh, we've just heard that actually there's more to this than the cockerel, more to this cockerel than people think, and we should maybe think about doing something about it." And I was like, "Look, we've just started in this role. We've got to make this a relationship with the college. Let's not try and throw everything under the bus right now." So we parked it for the best part of a year. And it was only actually after I was finishing that, so towards the end of my term, the beginning of my third year, that actually a couple of academics approached me and said, you might want to investigate this further. You might want to have a look. So we got given a couple of books on the sly, and we did our research, and we found out that this cockerel was likely to have been stolen in this Punitive Expedition in 1897. So we did our research. We wrote a paper, and essentially we said, look, we think that this artwork should be repatriated. We think it would be a fantastic thing for the college to do. We think it would send a really strong signal that this was an inclusive and open college. And we took that straight to the college council. Now, I knew how and I know that Oxbridge is a specific, has its own specific quirks and problems in this space. I underestimated the extent to which this was. It was as if I was suggesting we burn the whole place to the ground. Like the panic about this sculpture of a chicken, for goodness sake, in the dining hall that ensued from this. I'd never ever seen anything like it, and it was fascinating to go through that process. We didn't. start a big protest. We didn't occupy the dining hall or anything. We did it in the most academic way possible. We wrote a paper, for goodness sake. We took it to the college council wearing our gowns and, ties and the rest of it. I mean, we did it in the most formal way possible. Obviously, the Daily Mail picked up on it and accused us of everything under the sun and said we were too sensitive and the rest of it, and we ignored that. But it was really, really interesting to see the challenge around dealing with, first of all, the history, the fact that this was connected to the college, and we'd obviously done our research in that space, but also not really getting where we were coming from. I mean, we were saying that, look, as students, we had a stake in this space, in this university, and we want to make it better, and we think this is a good way and a good opportunity to do so. The long and short of it is that it was taken down, it's still there, it's in a lab somewhere, in an undisclosed location, and I suppose the fight continues. But I think for me, the reason why I mentioned this story, and thank you for bearing with me on this, is because for me, the artifact was so intrinsically linked with my sense of belonging at the institution. And actually, I was somebody who was politically active in the university community. I wanted to get involved. I wanted to be able to feel proud of the space. I had a stake in it, and which actually isn't where a lot of students, and certainly not a lot of BME students and black students at Cambridge are at. So I was fortunate enough to be in a space where I actually genuinely felt that I had a stake in the place. And I've felt, and a lot of students felt, that that artifact didn't have a place then. It spoke to a wider sense of belonging. I suppose the other question going through that whole process was, how was this the first time this had come up? That was something that I found very, very strange. Like, how was this the first time that somebody had raised this issue and brought this proposal forward? And then when I looked back at the hoops that we had to jump through to even put this on the table, an understanding of the complex governance structures, who to go to, who is the right person to ask, to have the time alongside your studies to actually put this proposal together, to do research which wasn't on the curriculum. I had never, ever heard of this story before university, which was the thing that I found remarkable. Like, not throughout my entire schooling. It wasn't on the official university curriculum. This was something that we found out outside of the curriculum. But I realized that as a result of that, it's likely that I was the first black president of the College Students' Union. To get through all those hoops, that was the first time you could even put the thing on the table and then to take it forward. So for me, it was really, really interesting how some institutions are able to not allow difficult conversations to come up because people aren't given the opportunity to do so. And I think when we talk about a sense of belonging, that's a common, sometimes it's sometimes very hard to sort of get a tangible sense in it, but it's an important theme that comes to our work on the Black Attainment Gap. So if we look specifically at the Black Attainment Gap, at the BME Attainment Gap, where are we now? Well, we know that on attainment, 78% of white students will receive a first or 2-1, which drops to 66% for Asian students and about 53% for black students. I mean, that is outrageous. I mean, the idea that almost half of black students in this country won't receive a first or a 2-1, whereas the majority of white students will receive a first or 2-1 is absolutely outrageous. And if you then follow that on to employment, it's not surprising that 7% of BME students will be unemployed after 6 months compared to 4.3% of white leavers. And retention statistics are also as bad. And I think that for me, looking at, you can't explain away those numbers. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you are in rooms and in dialogue and in communication where you have these statistics and people try and interrogate them and say they're about other things. We know that even if you account for external factors which aren't to do with the university experience, the attainment gap persists. And as I said, this was a clear priority for me. I spoke at the University's UK Conference, one of my first speeches in this role. And I told a room full of vice chancellors that they had an absolute duty to act to stop what you can only describe this as the systematic discrimination of BME students in our universities. And as a result of that, and other subsequent conversations, we launched a joint project with Universities UK to look into this. I mean, the aim of this project is really to get to the bottom of this disparity. We launched a survey, and we've had a series of roundtables. The last one actually was yesterday at UE. And really what we're trying to do is to bring student unions, students and the sector and the higher education sector and leads in universities to come together to start to talk about what's worked, what hasn't worked, and how we actually make sure this becomes a strategic priority for the higher education sector, but also for institutions. So what causes the attainment gap? Well, there are no easy answers, no quick fixes. I think that's one of the things we can start with. We can definitely agree that there's no silver bullet. I was at a roundtable actually in number 10, and the Minister for Education was there, and you could see he's getting slightly frustrated at the fact he wanted that flashy policy that he could just announce and say this would be the thing that would solve the attainment gap. One thing doesn't exist. And that's why frameworks, in a sense, are so important. That's why embedding it throughout the entire universities is also key. Some of the things that are coming through from our evidence sessions, some of the hypotheses that we're testing, some of the things that came through our survey responses are around, first of all, insufficient information, advice, and guidance for students before they start. One of the things that I've noticed in this role, looking at a slightly different area around marketization, fees, and funding, is that the drive for institutions to market themselves and to compete against each other is not helping students make objective choices about where they want to study. On top of that, my understanding is that previous mechanisms that were in place to provide that information, advice, and guidance have been stripped back, and it is relying a lot more on parents and on teachers rather than any parents, teachers, and then the sort of the marketing departments of universities. And university, my sister's is applying to university, hopefully this year, and the universities are incredibly aggressive when it comes to marketing, because the logic of the current system means that they have to get bums on seats. And I think that's come at the detriment of objective information, advice, and guidance, and I think as a result people are ending up on courses which they may not be suited for. The other area is around curriculum design, and there's been some fantastic work that students' unions have led on around decolonizing the curriculum, about broadening the bookshelf. And I think it's important to highlight the two sort of strands of this, because on the one hand, we should be doing this for the sake of doing it. Okay, so we shouldn't be decolonizing the curriculum simply to get the figures down and to as an instrument to tackle the attainment gap. And once we've done that, then we can all go home and say everything's done. I think a truly liberated curriculum which reflects the student population that is being taught is vital, incidentally not just for BME students but for students as a whole, so that students understand and can really reflect on the history behind the courses that they're studying. But where this does fit into the attainment gap is students, in a sense, BME students not being empowered to make that transition from school to university, where at school, it's essentially being done to you, and at university, you're meant to be a partner in your education. And unfortunately, what happens is that BME students don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, don't see themselves reflected in what's being taught, and thus there is a disconnect between their experience at university and the institution. That also extends to curriculum delivery, and we heard about intersectionality as well. And curriculum delivery cuts across not just issues of race and ethnicity, but in accessibility in the round. And the traditional way in which universities have delivered their teaching must be challenged if we are to move forward in this area. Another striking fact and an area that obviously is intrinsically linked to this, as you'll, I'm sure, be fully aware of, is the lack of BME staff. It says here in senior positions. I mean, lack of BME staff in higher education, full stop, frankly. We know that only 0.6% of UK professors are black. And in a sense, when you actually start to go through these statistics and you look at how they haven't changed that dramatically year on year, you're in a slightly dangerous territory where you're actually guaranteeing BME students that they won't be taught by somebody who looks like them. And I think that is absolutely essential to the long-term solutions behind this problem. Because from my experience, and I'm sure people in this room have much better experience and much longer experience than I do, but in my experience, the biggest determinant of what is on the curriculum and what is being delivered is who is actually the lead organising the paper or the course or the module. And if it is simply not reflective of the student body, then you can understand how there will continue to be that disconnect. We also know that BME students are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that just compounds the issues that they have at university. We do a lot of work about campaigning around the current funding system for higher education, which we argue very strongly systematically discriminates and adds a sense of poverty premium for those students from disadvantaged backgrounds. BME students are more likely to fall into that category, which means they are having to make difficult choices about their finances when they're at university, which adds to the stress, which means they're less likely to have the flexibility to succeed. The other areas around sort of wraparound. So it's not always just about what happens in the classroom, but what about the support services where something goes wrong? Are they culturally competent? Are mental health services supportive, able to support, able to connect with those students? Do students feel comfortable going to those and accessing those resources? And again, if there aren't people there who, at the very least, you have confidence, understand your experience, you're not going to avail yourself of those services. And then the broader, more fluffy point, but equally as important, is around the institutional culture. Is the institution taking a lead on this? Is the institution being clear with their students that they have a problem about this when it comes to the attainment gap, and they are doing everything that they can to address it? Or is it something that is being brushed under the carpet and pretended it's not a problem? The real big question is how have we ended up where we are? I mean, the reality is, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, we've seen a huge expansion of higher education. And obviously that's seen an expansion of the debt burden on students. But that expansion of higher education has seen more people from disadvantaged backgrounds and more people from black and minority ethnic backgrounds going to university than ever before. The problem is what happens to them when they arrive, and that's the next stage that we need to look at. The extent to which, or the rate at which the universities have expanded to include more students hasn't been reflected in the extent to which universities have changed to accommodate the new students that they are now teaching. So when we talk about the attainment gap, look, it's not, the aim of this project isn't to get those figures down to zero. I mean, that's not the ultimate aim. The ultimate aim is to create an environment, to create a higher education sector which is inclusive, which empowers black and minority ethnic students and empowers them to go on to be leaders as well within higher education in whatever way they may do so. At the moment, the system isn't set up to allow that to happen. So in terms of the longer term things, I don't want to preempt what we'll come out with in our report, which is expected to come out around January time. But alongside that, we are continuing to work with the rest of the sector, who, in many other parts of the sector, who are already on this agenda. We've got really pleased to see much more robust proposals from the Office for Students around the access and participation plans. I think that really marks a step change in the way that we do widening participation, that we're not just talking about getting in, but about students succeeding once they're there. We've obviously got the Race Equality Charter, and I remember going through that process at my institution, and the really fascinating insights you got from the survey when you compared students from BME backgrounds and white students. Incidentally, at Cambridge, there was no aspiration gap between white students and BME students, which means that when you are designing an intervention, you have to make sure it's evidence-led. Don't just put in a straightforward mentoring scheme to raise aspirations if the data is telling you that's not what we need. And I'll just end by saying this. Look, I am, despite the sort of doom and gloom of this presentation this morning, I am an optimist, especially in the current political climate, where I do genuinely believe that despite what is happening, I know that our generation, when we take the reins, will not allow the same things to happen. We will, in many ways, it will be a reaction against the inequality and division that is taking place in our society today. But whilst I'm an optimist, and I believe that politics will do its usual pendulum, the reality is the figures don't suggest that these changes will necessarily happen on their own. And we cannot be complacent. So we need to take action today. The data apparently suggests that the attainment gap will be closed in about 85 years. And whilst I'll still won't be able to be retired by that point, I don't think we can wait that long. It needs not incremental change, it needs absolute step change. And that's why we're treating this as a priority. And I'm sure you'll share our agenda, and I look forward to working with as many of you as possible to make this a reality. Thank you. So I think I have time for some questions.
Thank you for your talk. Quick question, just picking up on the reference to offer and OFS and the race charter. Do you think there's, just reflecting on some of the guidance that we've had from offer in the past, which has been a bit more explicit in relationship between the attainment gap, race charter work, do you think we're missing an opportunity under that new guidance from offer? Because it seems a bit, sorry, OFS, I'll need a bit more coffee to wake up from that long journey. Do you think we're missing out on an opportunity to really make some real change here? Because it seems it's a bit vaguer than it was before in the past. And I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say it's a bit vague, do you
mean
the...
I suppose basically, I remember looking through guidance that was provided by offer, and offer made a very clear link between using the race charter and monies from offer to support work in that area. Very, very clear. I won't try and cite the page because that might be a bit too sad. But I suppose when I'm looking at the new guidance that's coming out from OFS, yes, it's clearly talking about the attainment gap, and it's making references to that, so clearly addressing the point that you've made here. But it doesn't make reference, it doesn't really always suggest about what tools could be used. For example, the race charter. And I'm not, obviously there's pros and cons to any charter, which we've talked about earlier. But part of me thinks there's a missed opportunity to make real change here to students, to bring to life more broadly those messages you've gained from your own experience at Cambridge.
Sure, I think that's a good question. What I would say, and I'm conscious that the OFS is here, so they may be able to answer your question a bit more directly. My understanding is that the guidance isn't out yet. So we've had the consultation, which we responded to, and we are working, and we'll continue to work very closely with them on that. I suspect what we're trying to do is make sure that we align as much as possible come January, so that when the guidance is approved, the Universities UK project and the NUS project can also announce the sort of our findings from our project as well, and then that can also be used together. Now, from my understanding as well, the OFS aren't that prescriptive when it comes to certain things, but I've no doubt that they will certainly point in the right direction in terms of what sort of levers should be used in order to tackle the attainment gap. I don't imagine that we will see a weakening of the links between the levers. I can only imagine them getting stronger.
Hi, my name's Jess Widsford. I'm from the Office for Students. Absolutely, as you're saying, Amatey, we aren't expecting to see any weakening of any of those levers, and in fact, we expect them to get stronger. So Amy and I are doing a session later talking about how we can use access and participation plans to strengthen work around equality and diversity. In previous offer world and in our guidance, yes, we made explicit reference to various different tools that could be used. In our last set of guidance, we kind of split out what was our kind of regulatory information and what was effective practice. All that information that was in our previous guidance is still there. It's just in the effective practice guidance. As you said, we'll be producing new guidance for the next set of access and participation plans following our consultation, and that will be going out early in the new year, but absolutely we don't expect to weaken any of that guidance. Thanks.
Hi, Sarah Rankin from Imperial. There are a number of charities that are working very effectively in this space. So I'm thinking being London-based charities like Generating Genius and the Amos Bursary. So are you sort of learning from those charities and thinking about how universities can work more effectively with those charities, and maybe how the Office of Students can sort of facilitate that process, because they are very good in, you know, increasing recruitment and also retention, and also offering support for those students once they've finished their degrees and getting into, you know, careers and jobs.
Absolutely, and we have a number of organisations that have been to our roundtables alongside institutions and students. If there are more, please do let us know, because we're keen to invite as many people to them as possible. But also, when in January will be the start of a much longer conversation, much longer campaign, and the key thing is to engage as many stakeholders as possible. And we have been approached, and we do invite people to our roundtables as well. One of the challenges, but one of the exciting things about the project is that it does cut across so many different aspects of students' lives and involves so many different parties and so many different stakeholders, whether that's internal to the university or externally. So it will have to engage more and more people anyway, but we have certainly have learned from lots of organisations already, but more than happy to have a conversation about others.
Hi, Jiten Patel from the Open University. Excuse me. I think one of the things that still I'm surprised about is the fact that we're still referring to the deficit model of the attainment gap, which is focusing on the student not achieving, as opposed to maybe using more appropriate language, which is actually, this is the degree awarding gap. Why are institutions not awarding the similar levels of degrees to BAME students?
That's a very good point, and we had a very long conversation internally about that. One of the reasons why we stuck with the attainment gap, two reasons really. One is sort of name recognition, which when doing campaigns is sort of quite important for our membership. The other is, one of the concerns we had around the awarding gap was that even though attainment is a focused part of a much broader conversation about student experience, it becomes even more focused as if the issue is at the end when you get awarded the degree. And what we wouldn't want is a situation where it just becomes about how the degrees are awarded, rather than sort of attainment throughout. But what I would also say to that is that in all our messaging and all the language that we use in all the wraparound around the sort of broader campaign, we completely reject the deficit model, and we make it very explicitly clear that there's a structural problem with universities. But I do take your point, it's been raised on a number of occasions, but we have stuck with that for those reasons.
Hi, Adrian Liu from Glasgow Caledonian. Thanks for your presentation. Look forward to the findings of the report in January. At this early stage, are there any sort of early findings that you could share in terms of where, back to your point about being an optimist, where there are good stories that where the attainment gap is much narrower. I'm just thinking of profiles of different types of universities, like post-92 universities, or if there's academic disciplines that are doing better than others, or if there are geographical considerations. Are there different slices that we could be looking at beyond the sort of overall figure that could inspire us?
Yeah, I think, and I suppose it's quite early as well, and I don't have sort of the details in front of me. What I would say is that the thing that sort of unites or is a common thread across the places where I would say they're doing well, the students are on board, and they have a pool of students, normally specifically BME students, who are actively working as part of the agenda and are empowered to do so and gain from doing it as well. So it's not just an institution initiative, it is a real partnership between the institution and the university. An example is Huddersfield with their BAME Ambassador Scheme, Kingston with the curriculum consultants. These are places where two very, very different schemes, but you can clearly see it's got buy-in from the Students' Union, it's got buy-in from students, and those students can affirm that they are empowered throughout that experience. The other sort of aspect or common theme amongst places I would say are doing it successfully is when there is leadership from the top. So it's clear that it's an institutional priority, it's clear that the council or the governing body are holding the university to account on it, and it sort of permeates throughout the entire university. This is what the university is about. It's not being left to a practitioner in a department to have to do. It's about the whole institution being behind the agenda, and that does require leadership from the top. In terms of disciplines, I think it's sort of easier to say that on the conversation around decolonising the curriculum have gone much further in the humanities than in STEM. And I think we've got to work out how to crack that conversation when, it's about objectivity, it's about, when actually, I think the conversations that need to be had there are much, much more about reflecting on the actual discipline and why we're studying what we're studying and who is behind it, and also what are the contributions from others outside of who we learn as well. So I don't have any specific institutional discipline approaches, but the ones that I think in terms of the curriculum conversation, it's got much further in the arts and humanities than in STEM.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Clark, Goldsmiths College. Thank you for your talk. Fascinating and fully supportive of what you're doing, and want to get involved as much as possible at my institution. I just wondered if you've got any information on early career researchers, so in terms of keeping them, kind of like a pipeline and supporting them to stay within the institution, and any kind of figures or not figures or facts on retention and issues around retaining early career researchers and then progressing them through the system, given the statistic of 0.6% of black professors are non-white.
So I think that is a very good point. I don't know. I know that off the top of my head, so whilst black students are more likely than white students to go to university, it drops in half in terms of going into further study, and I would imagine then as a result of that, retention isn't good either, but I don't know the specific statistics on that, but I will actually look them up because I've been meaning to do that. One of the things in terms of the longer term piece around the pipeline, I firmly believe that we won't really solve this issue if we don't sort out the pipeline. And I asked this at the round table yesterday. I asked the table, are there proactive schemes, initiatives, programs, in a sense of grad schemes, for specifically targeted at BME students to get them and fast track them into academia? And is there a sort of package of support around them to do so? Now, there are some institutions who have some really interesting schemes around undergraduate students from school children from sort of underperforming low socioeconomic backgrounds, getting them in through a sort of foundation year, and then getting them across the line and having that wrap around as they go throughout the university. Those students actually, in some cases, in a lot of cases, tend to do better than students who haven't gone in those schemes. Where is the equivalent for the other end in going into academia? And I don't think that is happening yet. And that's, I think, a really important part of where the conversation needs to go, because from what I've heard anecdotally, it's really difficult. You know, it's much less support. The financial burden is even higher. It's getting harder and tougher at the moment, especially as, you know, potential cuts to universities are on the horizon. So it's absolutely essential that we sort out the pipeline, and that's something we'll definitely be exploring. I think actually the first bit is, do we have that data? And I'm not sure quite whether we do, but that's something I'll definitely chase up.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for having me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks.